Hello, this is Dr. Harper. This video is in project management, and this video is on Wysocki, the different models. So let's bring up the lecture notes. In Wysocki, he starts with the fundamental, to compare Wysocki with the PMBOK. Now PMBOK, remember, had the process groups with initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. They had the different knowledge areas, and they had the input tools, techniques, and outputs. And we covered the introduction to Wysocki, and then we had the PMBOK 1 with the qualitative methods, and then the PMBOK 2 with the quantitative methods. Also in PMBOK, we had the project management processes, and where we have initiating processes, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. Well, in Wysocki, he has something very similar, but he has it changed a little bit and a little bit more practical and a little broader in application. For example, the project management lifecycle models, he has those. He has traditional, and then the complex, which is agile, extreme, and then we get into combination, which is a hybrid. And then he has the effective complex project management framework, and he goes beyond just presenting the models to how you manage the models. So the introduction, part 1, is chapters 1 through 5, and that's pretty much the same as PMBOK. And the traditional is also the same as PMBOK, except he changes a few of the terms around a little bit, but essentially it's the same material, a little bit more applied. And then the models, which we'll cover in this lecture, and there's where he gets in traditional, agile, extreme, and then hybrid. We'll focus on the traditional, agile, and extreme today in this lecture. Okay, an overview here. He has this life cycle model of scope, plan, launch, executing, and closing. And he has 3 project types: the traditional type, TPM, agile, APM, and extreme. Well, with the project types, he also has the different models within that type. And then within the models, he breaks that down even further. So there is a structure. Well, for traditional, he has the linear and incremental, and we'll look at even more than that. For agile, he defines an iterative and adaptive. And for extreme, he has extreme and emergency. Essentially, emergency is extreme backwards. Okay. So first of all, comparing PMBOK terminology with the process groups with Wysocki. Well, initiating, Wysocki calls that scoping. And so in the initiating process in PMBOK is the same as a scoping process in Wysocki. Planning is the same. Executing, he calls that launching. You execute a project within PMBOK. You launch the project within Wysocki. And then the other two are pretty much the same. Okay. And sometimes he refers to monitoring, controlling as executing. And so he does sometimes refer to it as executing and sometimes monitoring, controlling. It depends on really the application and how he's applying it. Okay, so now when we look at this project management lifecycle model, scope, plan, launch, monitor and control, and close. So there are 5 different stages to this cycle. In the scoping process overview, the scoping process, he defines 3 primary documents. The COS is conditions of satisfaction, requirement breakdown structure, the project management life cycle model, which are going to be these up here, which are these here. This is life cycle model and different versions of it. Which one do you want? And then an overview statement. And so he defines these 4 terms, which we'll talk about today in this lecture. But then from scoping, then he goes to planning. In the planning process overview, he defines practically a joint project planning session where everyone's coming together to plan the project as they move forward. Well, notice he takes this project overview statement here, brings it over here, and from there he has a project definition statement, the RBS requirements breakdown structure, and here he has the traditional WBS and the critical path method. Okay, one is the work to be done, and the other he has the actual schedule up front, because that's going to where everything is going to reside as far as the cost and risk and procurement and everything will be in that time scale. in the critical path method and schedule. And then in the launching process overview, he talks about practical elements of launching a project: team development, kickoff meetings, the operation structure and plans. There's the change control again, resource and baselines and work packages. And he talks about how you develop those in different types of projects. And then in the executing, once it's been launched, you'll have reports and graphs, have the scope bank. And we talked about the scope bank back in PM BOK, where you have a scope bank. And so if it's in scope and out of scope, make sure you have that scope bank so you can actually move things back and forth. Documentation, and then meetings, and communication. And then closing, you have acceptance and documentation and audit, and then the final report. Again, very practical on how things are to be done. So whereas at the beginning, a lot of it is the same as PM BOK, but the way he's put it together and the way he frames it in these 5 different processes, very practical. And he talks about the practical aspect of actually doing it. Okay. So let's get into the scoping process. First of all, a simple process overview is the COS, RBS, PMLC, and POS. The conditions of satisfaction. Okay, now the conditions of satisfaction really represent getting with the client, getting with the stakeholders, the key stakeholders, and identifying a simple way to state that is, what are the conditions, if they are met, you would define as success? And so you're not really defining the project, you're defining the conditions upon which you will judge or validate, verify and validate the actual project. And so the COS is actually a statement that is put down and say, this is what we define as success from the stakeholders. And the conditions of satisfaction of the COS is approved, signed off on, so we know what we're going after before we actually start planning. Okay, in the project scope meeting, the whole purpose of this is starting with the COS and then going through the requirement breakdown structure, the different lifecycle models. Now the output is something called the POS, or the project overview statement. And the project overview statement is in Wysocki is essentially the same or extremely similar to the scope statement in PM BOK. So the project overview statement and scope statement is pretty much identical. And from that, you come down to the WBS. And the WBS is the same in PM BOK or Wysocki. But coming from the conditions of satisfaction to the POS, then you go through a number of things. You go through your resources. You go through different types of project lifecycle models that are going to be appropriate. And we'll talk about that in this lecture today. You'll create your requirements breakdown structure. In other words, what requirements do you need for this project? You assess completeness of requirements, classify your project, and this is the this is PMLC. Which one or ones are we going to be doing? And then you actually decide on a project approach. And then so notice this POS, or project overview statement, will have all of this detail in it, much like a scope statement. Now, so this is kind of like the general framework, but for small projects, conditions of satisfaction session, the COS session, could be done in an hour or two. It's the scoping meeting. You have the request, you have clarifications, response, you go back and forth, get agreement, and then you put the plan to the POS together. Okay, and so in small projects, this can be done informally and with a few amount of people because it's a small project. But for larger project, it becomes much more formal. In other words, you start with the work breakdown structure, the project management lifecycle models, okay, and then you actually define your requirements breakdown structure. You break it down to make sure that you know what the requirements are, what your requirements, identify resources, etc. And actually you go back and forth between that and your project management lifecycle model. Is this traditional? Is it agile? And we'll look at all the different definitions here below. But you're going to identify, here's your requirements, here's your model, go back and forth, and then you come to a project overview statement. In other words, this is much more formal, and these meetings can have multiple meetings simply because the requirements breakdown structure, that could be a huge document. What requirements are there? Well, the requirements up here are pretty much in the request, clarification, and response, okay, in the small projects. But down here, it has to be formalized and structured because usually it's going to be an ordinal relationship of your requirements. Some are more critical than others, but they all have to be met. And they're critical for different reasons. Okay, first of all, in summary, the POS, Project Overview Statement, is similar to the scope statement. COS is the conditions of satisfaction. You start with that. You end with the POS. And in the middle, you have your requirements breakdown structure, which identify your resources. Now, one thing that in creating your POS, the SMART, this is, some of you probably heard this before. The SMART is an acronym, which it has to be very specific, so you know what you're doing. Measurable, so you know where you are, where you've been, where you're going. Assignable, so you can delegate, make sure everyone knows what they're doing. Realistic, make sure everyone can do that. And time-related, it is a project. It has to be done on time. So a SMART POS have these 5 elements to them. Okay. The planning process. So now we have our work breakdown structure. We have our POS. Now the first thing that we do, we take the COS, the requirements breakdown structure. I keep saying resource breakdown structure, pretty much the same thing. One's requirements, the other identify resources for those requirements. But then the next two is the POS and PDS. In other words, the POS is the project overview statement, which is the result of the scoping process. But then notice the POS was generated from the key stakeholders or the clients. The PDS, the project definition statement, is an internal document where you identify exactly what we need to do to satisfy the conditions of satisfaction and that project overview statement. So whereas the POS is outward looking, PDS is inward looking to where this is what we need to do. And so the PDS is more of an internal document. Now, once we've taken the overview statement, and the PDS is not the WBS, it's a definition of what we're doing and everything we need to do. In other words, the project overview statement has a view toward the conditions of satisfaction and the requirements. That is a collaborative effort between the projects and project team and the clients, external or clients and key stakeholders. But then the POS is an internal procedure that is creating a definition statement. Here's how we would make that work. And then from the PDS, then you break your work breakdown structure. You identify the work to be done, okay? And then from that, and then it just fans out. You have your schedule for your critical path method. You have your budget for the earned value management, EVA, earned value analysis or earned value management. You have your communication plans. You have your risk management plans. You have everything in PMBOK. And so there's the details. And as I said back in PMBOK, here's where PMBOK comes in. And you select what is appropriate for this particular project, whatever project you're in. How much or how little, there again, that's an art. Okay. So in the decomposition of the work breakdown structure, you can have status and completions are measurable. The activity is bounded. In other words, it's not unlimited. You pretty much know the start and stop and know what you're doing. The activity has a deliverable. In other words, you know when you're done and there's a deliverable. You have something moving into satisfaction of your statements. Time and cost are easily estimated because you're reporting it internally and externally. Activity duration is within acceptable limits. Okay, and we get into CPM, and in this course, critical path method has one estimate for time. Activity duration within acceptable limits. We will get into pessimistic and optimistic and PERT to make sure we know what the limits are. Okay, and those limits are acceptable limits. And if we predict a pessimistic much, much too far, then that would alert us to maybe, the most likely may be fine, but the pessimistic is so far out. If that happens, and we say it could happen, then the risk begins to go up and we have to rethink our project. Work assignments are independent. What that means is that once you have delegated work, a work package to a group, then they're going to do that within, they're independent within other groups. In other words, groups can work together, but then that would be a work package. Okay, the planning process, the WBS, you break it down to activities, and sometimes those activities are broken down into tasks. You estimate the task, cost, time, predecessor relationships. You create your network, and then create your schedule and apply people, resources to that network. And like we said before, the task and activity quite often are the same things. Tasks are smaller versions of activities. Activities sometimes are larger, and tasks are within an activity. But the smallest level of the lowest level in your hierarchy, that's what you're going to be putting in your network and your CPM. Okay, then you have your task on arrow, activity on arrow, task on node, activity on node, and there's your network. And then you're populating that with your resources and your requirements. Okay, overview here before I get into details. In the launch, you have your team, you have your core team, your client, and your contracts. The meeting, you have a kickoff meeting, schedule meeting, and ad hoc meetings, and he talks about all of those. In your operations, on how things are going to be working, scope statements, request, communications, resources, work packages. Monitoring, controlling, again, you have reports and graphs, scope bank, documentation, and meetings. And then over here you have acceptance, documentation, audit, final report. Okay, he goes over these in a fair amount of practical detail. But for the rest of this meeting, let's start looking at the different types of models within his structure of landscape, the project landscape. Okay, over here on the left is a project landscape, and notice there's three quadrants. Quadrant 1 is the lower left, and that's traditional projects. And he defines the different types of project types from the goal, which is what you're trying to achieve. The solution is how you're going to achieve it. So the goal can be clear or not clear, or defined and not well defined, or ill-defined, and the solution can be clear or not clear. So if the solution is clear and the goal is clear, then you have a quadrant 1, and those are traditional projects. We'll look at a number of different models within that type. But then when the goal is clear, but then your solution is not clear, let me make this a little larger. There we go. But your solution is not clear here. Now we have Agile projects. So Agile says you know what you're trying to do, but you're not really sure how to do it. And so as you start the project, you know the goal you're trying to achieve. There may be different ways of getting there. And Agile means you're flexible and you can move back and forth between different solutions or different procedures or different processes. Okay, but then if the solution is not clear and the goal is not clear, that's referred to as an extreme project. Well, those projects are happening more and more today. In other words, you have an area like going to having a global supply chain within an area using technology. You don't know how to do it. You're not really sure what it's going to look like, but you know you want to do it. And so what are we going to do about it? And so the project is defining the goal and defining the solution, how to achieve that goal within this global supply chain that's moving into an area that no one's been there, or no one in our industry has been there, or our company hasn't been there, so we're trying to move in and break into this market. And so you're not really sure what it looks like, you're not really sure how to do it, but we're moving in that direction. So notice that happens a lot these days. That is happening more and more these days because 50 years ago, 100 years ago, things would happen over 10, 20 years. And 50 years ago, things would happen over 5 to 10 years. Today, well, say 20 years ago, things were happening every few months. Now things are happening every day. Okay, so you want to move into this area, so how do we do it? Those are extreme projects. Now the fourth quadrant, which is very interesting, is the goal is not clear, but the solution is clear. That's a very interesting quadrant. And you think, why would that happen? And we'll talk about it again later when we get into the structure. But the emergency projects are popular projects today. In other words, R&D, research and development, and this is in the homework, R&D has come up with a brand new technique. So they announce it. Here's a technique. So where are you going to use it? Find a solution. I mean, find a place to use this new technique. The classic example, when I first saw this years ago when I was in research, and this is a true story. This is a long time ago, about 40 years ago. I was in research, and well, I guess I shouldn't tell stories. Anyway, we were doing field work. I was a research scientist. We were doing field work, and so the team, the project manager, brought us everyone together. Everyone come in. So we came in. You know, what are we doing? We got work to do. What are you doing? He says, okay, from corporate, from the higher levels, we have this mandate. We have to make some recommendations. And he pulled out a little bitty rectangle thing, a little bitty thing. He says, we have to figure out, and we have to propose and suggest all different ways that we can use this little thing. I say, what is that little thing? And he said, this is called an Intel chip. And they've created this chip, and they want to know all different types of applications this chip could have. That's an emergency project. So they went to the research labs to say, okay, what are they doing? How can this chip be used? Because they have a lot of new things that they're doing. The classic methods need new methods. So we have new methods, but how broad are the applications? And as a matter of fact, emergency type projects are not bad for R&D. In other words, you have your capabilities. So you have your capabilities on your initial application. But how many other applications do those capabilities apply to that you haven't even thought of? So sometimes emergency is one of the more important projects. Okay, let's go on. Okay, now over here, we'll talk about this in the next topic. This is the hybrid project management framework. And this is a framework. It's not really, it's saying, okay, well, it sounds really simple. Ideation stage, idea stage, where what will we do? And so we define what we're doing. We set it up, and then we execute it. And how well did we do? We didn't do well enough, so we go back. It's a feedback loop. And you keep going back and back and back until you emerge, till you converge to a type of project or solution, depending on which quadrant you're in. You converge to something that's satisfactory, and then you have to make the decision, stop, we're going to use this. Okay, so we'll talk about that in the next topic. But I put it up here up front because it does apply here. Okay, and as a matter of fact, putting these four quadrants together in this framework, he calls it effective complex project management. Effective complex project management, and that's the title of his textbook. Okay. Now we start breaking it down. So traditional project models, these are project types, are broken down into linear models and incremental models. Agile project type models are broken into iterative and adaptive. And extreme are extreme and emergency. Okay, so let's go through each one of these. So now we're going to get into them. So here's our scope, plan, launch, monitor, control, and close. There's our 5 stages. So this is a nice linear stage life cycle. He calls this a project life cycle. Okay, now let's look at all the different models. Okay, first of all, overview. Again, I've taken the quadrants and put here when the goal is clear, solution is clear. That's a traditional project management. And there are two types of models, linear and incremental. When the goal is clear, the solution is not clear. It's the Agile project management type. And there's iterative and adaptive. When the goal and solution both are not clear, that's the extreme. But when the goal is not clear, but the solution is clear, that's the emergency. Okay, and so first of all, the traditional project lifecycle model, which is linear and incremental, those are the only two. There's others here, and we'll look at others here in just a second. So the goal here is clear, and the solution, which is the plan, launch, and monitor control, there's the solution. This is the part that's clear for traditional. And so within the 5 stages of the lifecycle model, the goal they're talking about is going to be over here under the scope. The solution they're talking about is over here under the plan, launch, monitor, and control. And notice close here for the traditional is not really part of the solution because you're closing it out. You're done. You've achieved it. Okay. For the Agile, it's the same thing. Here's the goal. Over here's the solution. But this time the difference is that for Agile, you have a feedback loop. It goes from close back to the plan. You have a feedback loop back here. And the different types of iterative and adaptive, the feedback loop is either called an iteration or it's called a cycle. And the distinction between an iteration and a cycle, the difference between an iteration and a cycle, we will get to here in just a second when we look at an iterative Agile project management type model and adaptive model. And finally, the difference between the traditional Agile and extreme type of projects is the feedback loop is called a phase, and it goes all the way back to the scope. Why? Because really you're changing the scope. You're changing the goal. So notice the Agile, the solution is not clear, and so the feedback loop is monitoring and changing the solution. With the extreme, the goal is not clear, so the feedback is going all the way to the scope stage to redefine the goal within the scoping process. And so that's a really simple overview of traditional, just goes straight through, doesn't stop. Agile cycles back, but it cycles back feedback loop to the plan. Extreme cycles back feedback loop back to the scope. So they're really good, simple structures, easy to remember, and it makes sense. But let's break it down a little bit further. Okay, traditional project management. Let's break this down. Well, we can break the traditional project management down into linear, which is called the standard waterfall model, and the rapid development waterfall model, or the incremental. Okay, first of all, here's our clear goal with a scope, clear solution, and closing out. Now, the standard waterfall model, okay, and some people just call it the waterfall model. It's kind of like a waterfall. It's going in one direction, and it goes from the scope, plan, launch, it goes one direction. You don't go back. You keep going forward, just like a waterfall. That water doesn't go back up. It goes down, okay? And so it's one direction. It doesn't go back. You know what you're doing, and you do it, and you're done. But there's different versions of the linear. Okay, the rapid development waterfall model. Well, this is still going in one direction, but it's not going in one direction on one particular path. Now we have something called swim lanes. It's rapid development, so now on the monitoring controlling here, once it's launched, the monitoring and controlling will have multiple channels. And these channels are referred to as swim lanes. In other words, you're going to break this up into swim lanes, so the linear life cycle model can be done faster, rapid development. So if you can do it faster, then create a parallel paths, and do this and conduct it much faster. Okay, well, the swim lanes can be defined by either functions or features. In other words, you say, first of all, the maximum cohesion within a swim lanes, minimum coupling between the swim lanes. Well, that makes sense if you start thinking about it, because within a swim lane. Within a swim lane, you want maximum cohesion. In other words, you want everything working together within that lane. In other words, that lane to be efficient and effective and successful, you have to have everything there. You can't do it if something is not in the lane. You have to wait until it's there, and it just delays everything. The whole purpose of this is rapid development. So they have to have cohesion within that lane. Everything is there that you need. Now, minimum coupling between the swim lanes kind of goes hand in hand with maximum cohesion, because minimum coupling between the lanes, you don't want dependency between these lanes, because then the progression of one will either support or undermine or jeopardize the progress of another lane. And so therefore, back here on the planning stage, in the planning part, if you know you're going to have a rapid development, then back here, you're going to pretty much define what these lanes are going to be. And you're defining them either by the functions. Okay, the functions meaning if you have a device or a final product and different functions are independent of one another, then you can define a function independent of the other modules within that product. For an automobile is a good example of that. Well, you can define the windshield wipers separate from the differential. They're independent of one another. And you develop those with a rapid development and you put them together at the end. Okay. So you're going to do that up here in the planning stages. And then once you launch it, you identify, back here, you identify what's going to define the swim lanes for functions or features. Okay, you might have different features of different, getting back to the automobile, you can have different types of interior, different features. Some are green, some are blue, some are purple, some are polka dot, whatever they are. And so the features, the functions are the same, but the features are different. So you're going to have this many of each of those features, so each of those will be a swim lane. So you can define your swim lanes by functions or features, or both. Okay, once that's defined, you launch it to make sure everyone knows what we're doing, and because it is a waterfall model. And so it's waterfall one way, but now we have parallel swim lanes in the monitoring controlling. Now the next one is called incremental. So this is in parallel. Incremental is the same idea, but in series. And he calls them increments. And so in other words, back here in the planning stage, you say, okay, well, instead of doing them all together, let's develop part of it. If it's not necessarily separate, it's not called you don't have components. It's called an integral. It's called an integral type of a product where everything is put together like an Apple laptop. Everything goes together. So what you would do is you would build this part in the first increment, and then you build the next part, the next increment, then the next part. So if there's dependencies, then you create this component, this increment, this increment, this increment, and then you have the product. Now the increments then you can build part of the product here, and then that goes into the next part of the product here. That goes into the next part, and the next part of the next part. And so whereas the rapid development has parallel paths, the incremental PMLC has paths in series. And so, well, it may be longer. It'll take longer because you're doing them in series. But on the other hand, it enhances quality control because you're making sure the first stage, the first increment, I'll use increments, the first increment is correct. And it goes through, and we'll talk about stage gates here, I think the next topic. You quality check it, make sure it's okay before it goes into the next increment. And so quality control is there. Another way the increments have been used that have been successful is the first increment, it may be a complete product, but not all the features. So you release it, okay, and you have an early release, and let's see what the feedback is from the market. And from that feedback, the second increment, you might modify it somehow, and then it'll be the second increment. And they do that all the time with the software. Have you ever had your software updated? Okay, when will they ever be done with that software? They never will. So you could argue, and you could maybe say, well, is this like an incremental project management? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it looks like it during an increment. No, because they probably will never be done. They'll keep doing it. Okay, but there is value in launching, releasing, and closing out version 1.1 to version 1 or 2.1, mainly because you want to improve it. You want to improve it and tie it into technology as technology grows. Okay, this is called a staged delivery waterfall model, and so you have this closed out either components or the staged delivery aspect is an actual finished product, and you deliver it, and then the second stage is a modification and a second delivery of the actual product. Okay, good. Okay, moving on to Agile. So there's more, but these are two key types of traditional waterfall models: rapid development waterfall model and staged delivery waterfall model. And then you have the waterfall model, where you just have one swim lane and not multiple swim lanes. Okay, Agile. Well, Agile project management now, remember the definition here is the feedback comes back to the plan. Well, now it's not just going in one direction. Now we have a cycle or an iteration. Well, the differences is between, there's only two, an iterative Agile and an adaptive Agile. And here's the differences. The iterative is the goal is clear, because that's pretty much the definition of a Agile. But the solution is partially defined. And this is referred to as the Minimalist Agile project. And the Minimalist has to do with the solution is not completely defined, but it's partially defined. And it doesn't take too much to just a little bit more effort to complete it. In other words, it's fairly simple, straightforward. You're not really sure exactly what all of it's going to look like, but you certainly know what most of it's going to look like. And so the iteratives, it says iteration, so that you can iterate to move to the conclusion very quickly. Okay, so this is a minimalist. And these are different models that have been used with a minimalist. Prototyping, you have a prototype, and I think that's in the homework. Evolutionary development waterfall, you keep developing it. So the evolutionary development is the feedback system. Rational Unified Process, RUP, Dynamic Systems Development Model, Adaptive Software Development, and the Scrum. Now, a lot of people probably have heard of Scrum, and that's a technique of a rapid development, and it's pretty general, and it's focusing on the human resources on how they bring people together to actually come up with ideas. So here's a different models for different types of projects and different types of Agile projects. And maybe someone in this course at the end will pick one of these and create a project. And actually in the past, people have picked some of these to look at them further. And for example, Scrum has been used quite a bit. What's the characteristic of iterative? It's characterized by iterations. More is known about the solution, but enhancements will need to be made. Often iterations have a focus on improving minor aspects of the solution with the general solution intact. So you're not changing the solution, you're changing minor aspects of the solution. Cancellation of an iteration is not common. Why? Because the general solution is intact. You're not going to cancel an iteration. You're going to go through and just make that change. They're minor aspects. And if it's a minor aspect, usually you pretty much know what you have to do. Cancellation of an iteration is not common. It could happen, but it's not common. But a redirection within a solution or additions to solution results are appropriate. And that's the idea of improving the minor aspects. So this is one type on the end of the spectrum of an Agile project. And that is small things need to be made so that we can put everything together in a neat package at the end. Okay, but the basic solution is not really altered. It's just improved, and small improvements and aspects of it are being made. Now, the other end of the spectrum, the adaptive, is the goal is clear again, but the solution is poorly defined. And this is the maximalist Agile project. And he only suggests one type of model. There may be others, but in the book he only talks about the adaptive project framework, which is his framework that he's used. So Agile, you think, oh, we need to change. Wait a minute. We need to change not only small aspects of the solution, we need to change the solution. So the solution is poorly defined, so much so that we may have to have different approaches. So we know what we want, but now the approach is not modifying the approach to make it work. It's backing up and doing entirely different approaches, different solutions. So it's characterized by cycles. He just used a different word. Less is known about the solution, and discoveries about the solution will need to be made. So up here, it's implementing minor aspects. Here, it's discovering about the solution. It's discovering solutions. It's learning. It's discovering ways of doing it. Okay, up here, that discovery aspect is not there. Down here, it is. Cancellation after a cycle is not uncommon to enable a restart. Why? Because we're looking at changing the actual solution process, as well as aspects of the current solution. So notice the two spectrums. So the iteration here simply says, oh, my solution, this is going to work. It's done before, but it's not completely defined. I need to modify it somehow to have minor aspects to make it fit this particular project. But a cycle, on the other hand, it's not just an iteration, it's a cycle. The cycle is saying, okay, when I get into this solution, I might find out that this is not going to work. I have to back up, come back to the planning stage, and try a new solution. So that's more of a cycle. It's not just an iteration on the same solution. It's a cycle back to create a brand new solution. It can be that way. So you can eliminate one solution and start a new one. Or a cycle could be significant changes to a solution, or it could be closer in the spectrum, closer to an iterative Agile project. Okay, so that's the idea between iterative and adaptive. Okay, and so again, I want to emphasize a spectrum. So don't say, oh, this is adaptive, so we have to do it this way. We have to keep changing the solution. Not necessarily. It's just knowing there is a spectrum and going back and forth in the spectrum to achieve a solution. Okay, and where and how you go back and forth, and when you focus on a solution, the closing out your project, that's an art, and that art is resides with the project manager and his team. Okay. Now extreme. Let's define extreme. Well, extreme project management, there's two types, and here the goal is not clear, the solution is not clear, and these are called phases, to pick another word. Now the feedback loop comes back all the way to scope, because we have to redefine our goal. Okay, extreme. Each phase searches for a solution to a goal with adequate business value. In other words, each phase, okay, since the goal is not set, the scope triangle remains flexible. Remember the scope triangle. Well, first of all, we had the triple constraint in PMBOK. We had the scope triangle in Wysocki. Okay, so the goal is set within a phase. Within a phase, the goal is set, but you have to be really flexible with your scope triangle. A project, as the project progresses, definitions of goal and solutions from phases become clearer. Okay, that's an aspiration. In other words, as you progress, every time you have a phase, and that phase should be converging to something that's going to be a goal that you're going to achieve and a solution on how to achieve that goal. You should be converging to a closure of the project. As goal and solution definitions become clearer, phases become longer. In other words, if you, during a phase, you identify this isn't working, don't keep doing it. Stop and go back and try something new. But when things start working, then you're going to continue developing it. And so your phases will become longer and longer and longer because you're getting closer and closer to an answer of your project. A good example of this is a saying that says, why would you keep doing something because it doesn't work? And so some people are very good at that. Let's go to the people to define the solution. And the reason we need a solution is because the problem was defined by the people who created the solution. And so why would you use the same solution that created the problem? And so you go back and the phases become longer because hopefully you're moving toward a solution then. Review. When portions of an extreme project can be spun off to an agile project or a traditional project. Okay, now this is key. Actually, it's so key, I'm going to bold this and also make it large. And so this is a glimpse into what we're going to be doing in the hybrid. And then at the very end, we're going to be looking at this particular spinning off, moving back and forth, and being flexible. Portions of an extreme project can be spun off to agile or even traditional. And so this is a key to this course, and that is we can learn these different types of projects, models. That's what we're doing today in this lecture. But knowing the different types, that doesn't mean you're stuck with one. That means you back up, understand when one should be used, understand your project, and then you move back and forth when appropriate. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, now emergency, each phase searches for a goal that can be achieved by a solution with adequate business value. So the goal here is what you're after. Now, once you've identified the goal, okay, but the solution is not clear, then emergency may go to extreme. When emergency goes to extreme, then extreme may go to agile. When you know your solution, you're just modifying it. Then sometimes agile will move to traditional. So this right here is like the bigger picture. You have your extreme, you have your agile, you have traditional, and notice in extreme, since the phases go back to the scope, back here, the scope. That's why business value becomes important. Since you're changing the actual scope of a project, then that simply means that business value now becomes a criteria. In other words, you want to create business value because once you've defined the goal, then success of a project is satisfying the stakeholders. But defining the goal or defining the purpose of the project, that goes into a portfolio analysis for business value of the organization. So the business value is creating the project, but conducting the project is satisfying the stakeholders in that project. So the extreme, since you're coming back all the way to the scope and not redefining the goal, then that goes back to the business value of the organization. Okay, and that's why these three models, traditional, agile, and the four quadrants, are essential to understand project management today and in the future. Okay, talking about the extreme, he has something called the INSPIRE framework. INSPIRE, INSPIRE. You initiate, and actually this is good for projects, but it's pretty much good for anything you do. Initiate says, I'll know it when I see it. Explore ideas, teams, approaches, create charters, general multiple overview statement. In other words, this is a brainstorming. Okay, you say, oh, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. Oh, well, wait a minute, that looks good to me. Let's go for it. And at this stage, what I have experienced from experience, let me say it that way, from experience, never ignore an idea, no matter how crazy. No matter how crazy, think about it, and think about why it can be done, and then think about why it could be done. Never dismiss an idea simply because you don't think it's going to work. Because you might come up with a cell phone. You may come up with an internet. Before they developed the internet, no one ever thought that would happen. Before they created a cell phone, no one ever thought that would happen. You might create radar back in 100 years ago. So never discount any crazy idea, because sometimes it's the crazy ideas that are the most important. In other words, I'll know it when I see it. Okay, no, well, maybe, So look at all of them. Second, speculate. Okay, well, I wonder if this will work. I wonder if this would work. You investigate feasibility of ideas, resources, conditions of satisfaction, constraints. Produce a list of rejected and accepted POS for launch. Oh, notice each one of these will have a POS, a project overview statement. But speculate is produce a list of rejected POS and accepted POS for launching. Now notice these accepted is going to be launched. The rejected, we're not going to do it. But we have put together a POS for the ones we're not going to do. Because when you start doing these things, especially in extreme, you might come up with ideas of, wait a minute, I've learned, well, maybe we've learned from this on, let's back up over here, maybe this rejected POS, now we see that it is an accepted one. Okay, the idea here is investigate feasibility of ideas. Would it work? Okay, up here is the creative brainstorming. Here's the practical feasibility. Incubate. Let's do it and see if it works. Now, right up here, you can have analysis paralysis. Make your choice, incubate it, and don't find out by thinking about it, by analyzing it. Learn by doing it. Do it. Assign resources, establish a plan, produce deliverables, maintain collaboration, flexibility, creativity, see what works and see what doesn't work. And let experience and reality teach you. Up here, don't fall victim to analysis paralysis. You're paralyzed because all you're doing is analyzing and nothing ever gets done. Finally, you don't know it's going to happen. That's why it's extreme. Try one. Do it. See what happens. And then review. Where are we? Evaluate each phase, results from phases as a group, and the status of the project. Make decision to proceed with more phases or close the project. Where are we? Do we keep going? Do we stop? And here is a team decision, a team discussion, stakeholder discussion, sometimes business discussion from your business key stakeholders. But the decision has to be a decision board. We're there. This is it. We're moving on, or creating another project. So I put this in the lecture because I think it's extremely practical. It's very good, and it's something that it not only applies to projects, it applies to anything you do, even anything you do in life. Okay, so let's go on. So let's compare. Now that we've defined them, let's start comparing some of these. Okay, first of all, very quickly, you can read this as well as I can. The nature, this is the traditional, this is agile, and this is extreme. The nature is a fixed methodology. You have a change management and a very flexible culture because you're changing the goal. Characteristic is compliance with the plan, coordination within the plan, and creativity to create a plan. The change process, the change conforms to the plan. The plan is king. or queen in the traditional. That plan is what you do. In Agile, change is managed within the plan. Okay, so you have the plan, but within the plan, you will have change. There's where you have the feedback loops. Now, Extreme, the change is the plan. The whole purpose of the plan is the change. Complexity and uncertainty. Well, it's going to be addressed in the plan. All the complexity and uncertainty is in your plan because the plan is fixed. And the Agile, it's designed and managed in your solutions. And finally, it's encountered in the goals and the solutions. So uncertainty could be even in the goals. Okay, so one is focused on the plan, the other's in the solution, the other's in the goals and the solution. Approach, plan focus. Actually, this probably should be higher. Is plan focus. It's all about the plan. Team focus is all about the team creating the plan. Stakeholder focus is all about the stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders to the project, key stakeholders. Communication. Usually it's one way because you're focused on the waterfall. One way. This is two-way because you have to collaborate, and this is multiple channels of communication because you have the team members, you have the stakeholders with the goals, and you have communications everywhere. The client will validate the deliverables. The client will collaborative involvement with the deliverables because it's a solution. But with the Extreme, the client has leadership roles in defining the goals. And so this is key on how the project manager deals with the key stakeholders. Or the key stakeholders, you represent the project under traditional. Let's do this. Under traditional, the project manager will present and represent and present the deliverables or milestones for validation to move forward. But for Agile, it's collaborative with the stakeholders to make sure this solution is something that's going to be valuable, okay, and it's going to be successful because since the solution has a feedback loop and is changing, then the solution is going to define success, okay. But then But then for the Extreme down here, for the Extreme, the client has leadership roles. They are working with the project manager and the project team, so it's they're taking the lead because they're defining the goals. Success drivers: triple constraint, value added, business value. We've already talked about that. So the Extreme is business value because you go back to the goals. The Agile is value added because as you're learning solutions, you're learning that's going to go into the assets of the organization because you're learning how to do things. And the success drivers under traditional is just a triple constraint. You get it done on time within budget. The team is independent, so therefore they don't have to be co-located. So a traditional waterfall, you can have people dispersed, even worldwide, as long as it's a traditional design. But Agile, because of the communication under Agile, they are dependent on one another because they have to work together to come up with a solution. So they're dependent on one another. So you have different people with different expertise. But for the Extreme, it's collaborative because you're not just trying to get a solution as an Agile, you're trying to create a goal. So you have to collaborate with people, and collaboration necessarily has compromise and also sometimes has conflict. Okay, team members are specialized because they're independent. They don't have to be co-located. They're generalist because when you come together, you have to understand each other's expertise because you have to communicate. And then a lot of times the team members are facilitators because the facilitators will facilitate the direction of the collaboration. Okay. Now the characteristics here. For a traditional, I'm going to have each one of these. I'm going to have the characteristics: well-defined, repetitive activities, few expected changes. Now the strength of the traditional. The entire project can be outlaid, can be scheduled at the very beginning of the project. You know exactly what you have to do. Just do it. Your resource requirements are known from the start. The most skilled team members are not necessarily required. You don't have to have really skilled team members. They just have to know what they have to do. They just do it. And co-location of teams are not required. They can be dispersed and even all across the world. The weaknesses: it requires complete and detailed plans up front. In some projects, you can't do that. Sometimes it's very costly. Sometimes it does not accommodate change well. You can't go back and change because it's a waterfall. It's one way. The deliverables realized late in the project. So the close is when you have your deliverable. Okay, well, you can change that with incremental and have deliverables in the middle. Must follow rigid sequence of processes and does not focus on client value. It focuses on deliverability. When do you use? When do you use the traditional? Simple projects, short time of completion, single deliverable, repeatable projects. You have control of your resources and the templates are available to implement. Okay, and so a lot of projects fall into this category, but a lot of projects don't today. The Agile. The characteristics of Agile is the goal is well-defined, solution is not. We've already stated that. The flexible approach, characteristic of very flexible approach, and changes are expected. It's part of the Agile project. Skilled team members are generalists rather than specialists, and co-location of team members recommended because they need to work together. Strengths. Deliverables are processes defined during the project. You're learning as you're doing the project. It's not about the deliverable. Part of the deliverable of an Agile is actually learning the solution. So you have deliverables during the project. The resources are strategically utilized because you have a loop feedback system, and so you have to strategically utilize those resources to focus on your deliverables. Lean operations are possible. You're designed because again, you're in control of the solution and changing the solution. It's designed for change, and you're focused on client value. In other words, you're focusing on the value for the client, not just the deliverable, but the client needs to sign off and validate. But since you're changing the solution, then you can focus on client value, on the client, not necessarily business value, the client value. The weaknesses: it requires two-way communication, requires increased client involvement. Sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's not a good thing. Deliverables not completely known initially because a solution can create new deliverables when you come up with new solutions and new resources. Project progress dependent on skilled team members. And if you don't have them, sometimes it's difficult to get them. When do you use complex projects? Goals important, even though a solution is not well defined. In other words, you got to get this done. You don't know how you're doing it, but you got to get it done. So let's just jump in and let's have a project, an Agile project, to define how to get this done. So the goal is very important. Incomplete definition of deliverables. Okay, you have a goal, but you're not really sure all the deliverables within that goal. You're going to define that during the solution. Agile. Unique learning and discovery needs. Okay, this is also a strength, is that you're going to be learning. Since you have iterations or cycles back here on your Agile projects, you're going to be learning about how to solve these things. And sometimes the most value from an Agile project is not the deliverable product or deliverables to the stakeholder. It's the internal assets of learning how to do this, how to learn how to do the actual project that you're doing, or maybe learning how to do other projects that are similar. Okay, finally, extreme. The goal and solution are not well defined. High uncertainty and complexity from the very beginning. Strong creativity in the team, and high client involvement. So those are the characteristics of an extreme project. Strengths: multiple complex goals. So you are going to be looking at a lot of goals that are very complex. Another strength is maximum flexibility in project execution. In other words, you're going all the way back to the goal. Maximum speed in product deliverables, because you can have shortcuts and etc. But as you get closer and closer, even though the phases get longer, you can have maximum speed in deliverables if you need to, because you have control of the goal and the solution. You have control of all that. And finally, strength is high client involvement. So notice that is a characteristic, that is a strength, that's also a weakness. So high client involvement sometimes is good, because the strength would be the client is involved. And so when we're done with this thing, you know they're going to validate it. You know they're going to accept it because they were part of the project. The weakness is they keep changing it every time we get together. So it could be a strength and it could be a weakness. The weakness, high risk of failure, variability of results. So it really depends. Every time you do an extreme project, you'll have different results. Subjectivity in defining project success. That's a key one. Since you don't really know what the goal is, and part of the project is defining the goal or defining the solution, once you're there, how do you know that what you have is good? You don't. And as a matter of fact, extreme projects sometimes, well, not sometimes, I'll say possibly the greatest value of an extreme project is failure, because you'll learn everything you don't want to do, so that you can come back and actually define maybe an agile project, because you know what you want now that you've failed on an extreme project. When do you use undefined projects? Significant long-term benefits desired, research and development, R&D. And I think you even have this in the homework. Okay. And finally, different applications. Now, I'm not going to go into this. Like if we were together, I do this in the class. It's fun. I'll say, what specific types of projects would fit in each cell? Traditional, linear, manufacturing, construction, engineering, urban development, high-tech, R&D. Well, linear, I'd say manufacturing would be more linear. Incremental could be construction or engineering. Iterative down here, here, agile iterative is more engineering and maybe urban development. Adaptive is more urban development and high tech. Extreme is more high tech and R&D, and emergency is more R&D. So it's kind of like going from upper left to lower right. But the point is, I'll solicit examples from class, from students, and the conversation, it's hard to stop. It's really interesting. People come up with all different ideas because each one of us have different backgrounds. And I learn from my students as much as I teach, especially with these kinds of applications. But finally, let me end with this last table. What specific types of projects would fit in a cell, each cell, as moving from one to another? In other words, from linear to incremental. And here I'm saying what type of project, just pick one and define it. Oh, it started as a linear and then it shifted to incremental. Or it was linear and it shifted to agile iterative. Okay. Well, first it was iterative, then it shifted back to linear. Well, you say, oh, well, that makes sense. It was iterative, but then we stop. We say, no, we know what we want to do. Let's go to linear. Just get it done. And then iterative to adaptive. Well, we start with iterative, and then we realize we got into the project, realize, oh, wait a minute. This isn't working. We have to shift to adaptive, and we have to start creating new solutions. Extreme to adaptive and extreme to emergency to extreme. In other words, moving back and forth. This is the hybrid part, and this is what we'll get into in the very next topic. Moving back and forth, and a structure to do that is going to be valuable within an organization to a project manager. It's not just doing a project. It's how that project within a business unit can be effective, and how a project manager and a project team can be effective within the business environment. Okay, so that's all I have for this lecture. This is Wysocki models. I hope this helps. There's a lot of information here, and notice I've just covered the basic outline. The book goes into detail, but if you notice, the book is a pretty easy read because he has stories and he talks about the practical aspects, what I think is excellent. I think it's excellent. It reads pretty smoothly. So I see what he's saying. I would suggest watch this video to get the understanding the basics, the definitions, and then he goes through and explains some very practical examples. So that's all I have for now for this lecture. I hope this helps. And so between now and the next time I see you, I'm going to urge everybody to be safe. Don't take anything for granted because I want you to keep on learning. So between now and then, take care.